Welcome to episode 2 of my Zombicide Black Plague paint tutorials. This time we're going to be painting the Wolfbomination from the Wolfsburg expansion set. As before, if you don't want to watch the entire tutorial, you can skip to the end of the video where I've placed a color index. I would recommend using a white or a grey primer for this miniature since most of the body is going to be a light grey. For my miniature, I'm going to be using Army Painter's Matte White Primer. There were a few spots that were hard to get with a spray primer, so I'm just going to touch those up using Valejo's white primer. The first part of the wolf I chose to paint was the inside of the mouth and the exposed belly. The paint I'm going to be using is Glistening Blood and Ceremite White, mixed about 2 parts red, 1 part white. This should give me a nice dark pink color. I'm not too worried about mistakes at this point. We're really just trying to get the paint into the deepest cracks between the ribs. Next we have to decide how much of the flesh below the ribs we want to appear exposed. I decided I was going to paint all of the abdominal muscles to make it look like that flesh had been torn away. Using the same color, I'm next going to paint the tongue of the wolf and the entire inside of the mouth. There's also some jaw muscle exposed in the side of the face, and I'm painting them as well. For the main body of the wolf, I'm going to be mixing equal parts Ceremite White and Filthy Soot to create a really light gray color. This is a very simple part of the process. I won't spend much time on it. Our main goal is just to cover the entire wolf with grey, trying only to avoid the parts we painted pink, the teeth and the ribs. This is how our wolf looks up to this point. Next we're going to paint the skull and ribs using a 50-50 mix of Ceremite White and Screaming Skull. I'm not using a pure white for the bone because I really want the teeth to stand out against the rest of the skull. The artist's concept of the Wolfbomination makes it look like the flesh has been torn away from its face. How much of the flesh has been torn away is completely up to you. You might want to make it look like only the top half of the face has been torn off. For myself, I'm going to make it look like all of the flesh on his face, back to the ears, has been torn away. I'm going to use the same bone color to now paint the ribs of the wolf. Next we're going to paint the mane of the wolf using a very dark grey, in this case Citadel's Skavenblight Dinge. I highly recommend watering your paint down about 50% with water for this part. You really want the paint to be able to sink down in between all the hairs, and I'm using an old brush just to mash it in. Now I'm going to paint the patches of fur on the front and rear legs. Initially I was torn about how much of the wolf I was going to paint a dark grey. I toyed with the idea of painting the entire top half of the wolf a dark grey, including the top half of the legs, but in the end I decided to go with a more scraggly look and just painted the patches of hair on the legs. Next I'm using the same 2-to-1 mix of Glistening Blood and Ceremite White to extend the jaw muscles up onto the skull. See in the artist's concept of the Wolfbomination that his paws are a much lighter color than the rest of his body, so I'm going to do a quick dry brush with some Ceremite White over the paws. For the last of our base colors, we're going to be adding some more Skavenblight Dinge, this time to the claws. Now I'm going to paint a stone pattern onto the base, and for this part any natural stone color will do, but I'm going to be using a mix of leather brown, Brainmatter Beige, and filthy soot. Because the base of this miniature is so large, I want it to have multiple different floor patterns on the base. First I'm going to use a sticky note and use it to help me trace a brick pattern onto the floor. So as you can see here, I've created a chevron pattern that takes up about 25% of the base. Next I'll create a smaller chevron pattern just inside the first one. Now I'm just drawing lines to make it appear as if each of these is made up of bricks. Once again, I'm going to be using a dark grey, Skavenblight Dinge, to trace the brick patterns I just drew. Now that that's finished, I'm just going to go ahead and fill in the rest of the base with random flagstone patterns. the bricks in our large chevron pattern, a leather brown, and the smaller bricks on the inside with Screaming Skull. Flagstones, I'm just going to randomly paint some of them Brainmatter Beige and others Zombie Skin, just to make them stand out. For the last step, I'm just painting all around the rim of the base with a dark brown, in this case Army Painter's Dirt Spatter. This is what our miniature looks like so far, and now it's ready for the Quickshade. At this point, we're just going for complete coverage of the miniature and the base. As soon as I have the miniature completely covered, I begin removing the Quickshade as quickly as I can. I'm letting the Quickshade pool in the creases of the muscles, but I'm removing as much as I can from the ribs and the mouth. This miniature is so large it took about 48 hours to completely dry. The miniature looks very glossy at this point, so now we're going to spray it with a matte varnish. At this point our miniature already looks really good, and nothing else needs to be done to it, but I'm just going to take it a few extra steps. The first thing I'm going to do is just touch up the teeth with Brainmatter Beige, which if you don't have, it is just a light ivory color. When you're doing highlights, you want to thin your paints down quite a bit, but you also don't want to have a whole lot on your brush. The last thing you want is for paint to run down into the cracks and cover up all the shading effects. Next, I'm going to touch up the fur of the wolf. I'm going to start off with a mix of 2 parts Filthy Soot and 1 part Ceremite White. Again, I'm using a really thin down paint, and you're aiming for a shade that is slightly lighter than the color you're painting over. Right now I'm covering all the raised areas of the muscle, covering most of it, but doing my best to avoid all of the creases so I don't cover up the Quickshade. Now I'm going to add a little bit more Ceremite White into my gray paint so that I have about a 50-50 mix of Filthy Soot and Ceremite White. I'm going to go over those same areas again, but this time I'm painting a smaller area. I'm only going to paint the most prominent features of the wolf. I'm also painting the tops of the toes on each of the claws. ribs and skull, I'm going to be using a 50-50 mix of Brainmatter Beige and Screaming Skull. I'm only highlighting the very tops of the ribs, and on the skull I'm only highlighting around the eye socket and the top of the nose. For the eye, I'm going to be using a Ceremite White, and I'm just going to be lightly touching the raised iris of the eye. Obviously you're trying to avoid hitting the inside socket of the eye, but if you do, you don't need to worry. Our next step is going to be using a black wash, in this case Citadel's Nuln Oil, and we're just going to lightly touch some of that into each socket of the eye. Next we're going to give the eye a glow effect, and I'm going to be using Fuegan Orange. It's a Citadel wash mixed with a little bit of water. I'm just going to keep adding layers of wash until my eyes have a subtle orange color to them. Once the eyes are finished, I'm going to give my miniature one last spray of matte varnish. One final touch I wanted to add to my miniature was a gloss coat over the claws of the wolf. To finish off your miniature, you may want to add some blood effects. I'm going to be using Citadel's Blood for the Blood God, just to put some extra color around the skull and the rib area. Is our finished product. I hope some of this was useful to you, and thank you very much for watching. Please don't hesitate to leave any questions you may have in the comments below.